Joseph Stalin, the undisputed dictator of Russia, formerly known as the USSR. His unyielding grasp on the reins of power lasted 24 long years from 1929 until 1953. During his tenure, he completely revolutionized the lives of the average Russian citizen. He led them through a brutal transformation of an agrarian society to an industrial one, as well as the extremely taxing years during the Second World War and through the everlasting, infamous Cold War. Through all these difficult times, most leaders would find it almost impossible to retain control over their people and remain firmly in power. But Joseph Stalin was unlike any other. He used fear and violence at will to ensure his place at the top remains unchallenged. He is credited with an astounding 20 million deaths during his reign, making him the second largest killer of all time behind only Mao Zedong, the Chinese ruler from 1943 to 1976. What sets Stalin apart from his contemporaries, though, was his absolute cold-bloodedness. His regard for human life was essentially non-existent. He's famously quoted as saying, "The death of one man is a tragedy. The death of millions is a statistic." And another, after the death of his first wife, he said, "This creature softened my heart of stone. She died, and with her died my last warm feelings for humanity." Here are some of Joseph Stalin's most infamous tools he used in order to create fear and compliance. Probably the most effective threat Stalin used very sparingly was the Gulag system, essentially a prison with mandated forced labor. Stalin viewed the camps as an efficient way to quickly advance his goal of industrializing the Soviet Union. These camps allowed him to access valuable natural resources such as coal and timber and take on huge projects through essentially what was slave labor. Additionally, Gulag camps became a destination for victims of Stalin's Great Purge, a campaign to eliminate members of the Communist Party and anyone who challenged his rule. When Stalin launched his purges, a wide variety of laborers known as political prisoners were transported to the Gulag camps. Opposing members of the Communist Party, military officers, and government officials were among the first targeted. Later, educated people and ordinary citizens, doctors, writers, intellects, students, artists, and even scientists were sent into the Gulag system. Furthermore, anyone who simply had family ties to disloyal anti-Stalinists could be imprisoned. Even women and children endured the harsh conditions of the camp. Without any notice, victims were randomly picked up by Stalin's security police and hauled to the prisons with no trials or right to an attorney. Prisoners of the Gulag camps were forced to work on large-scale construction, mining, and industrial projects. The type of industry depended on the camp's location and the area's needs. Some of the biggest projects accomplished by the Gulag labor crews include the following: the Moscow-Volga Canal, the White Sea-Baltic Canal, and the Kolyma Highway. These massive undertakings were done so with little to no regard for the prisoners' basic rights. Prisoners were given crude, simple tools and no safety equipment. Some workers spent their days cutting down trees or digging at frozen grounds with handsaws or pickaxes. Others mined coal and copper, and many had to dig up dirt with their bare hands. Camp prisoners often drudged through brutal weather, with half of the year facing sub-zero temperatures. The work was often so grueling that prisoners would handicap themselves by either purposely injuring themselves in an attempt to avoid work. Many workers died from exhaustion, while others were physically assaulted or shot by camp guards. Historians estimate that at least 10% of the total Gulag prison population was killed each year, totaling an estimated 1.7 million deaths during Stalin's rule. Like we touched on a little bit earlier, Stalin initiated in 1936 the so-called Great Purge. He used this so effectively to the point where there was nobody left opposing him. At the time, the biggest rival Stalin faced was the Communist Party of Russia. He ordered the arrest of hundreds of thousands of people who had any type of affiliation with the opposing party. Of the 103 highest-ranking members of the Communist Party, 81 were executed. The rest were sent to the Gulag without due process. Eventually, more than a third of the general public who supported the Communist Party died during the Great Purge. This of course had the effect of terrorizing the general population. Many people turned on friends and family members in an attempt to save themselves. Even Stalin's closest advisors weren't exempt from this fate. One of the most glaring examples of this was the head of the Russian secret police, Nikolai Yezhov. He was executed in 1940 after Stalin accused him of anti-Soviet behavior. But high-powered members like Nikolai didn't just get a death sentence. They also were made to disappear from history itself. Stalin understood the historical value of photographs and how to use them for propaganda. Stalin went so far as to use photo retouchers to delete his enemies from photographs, including Nikolai, who was essentially removed from the memory of the Russian people. In a shocking confession and in an eye-opening insight into the thought process of the dictator, Stalin said of his assassinations, "Who's going to remember all of this riffraff in 20 years' time? Who remembers the names of the boyars Ivan the Terrible got rid of? No one." As you can imagine, with the constant threat of the Gulag or worse looming over their heads, the remaining citizens living under Stalin's rule would have been extremely paranoid. This led most people to go to extreme lengths in order to ensure their safety. Perhaps the most famous example of this would be from the 18th Party Congress in Moscow in March of 1939. This was Stalin's first address after starting the Great Purge, and rightly so, everyone was anxious. As Stalin started speaking, he unknowingly mispronounced the name of the head of agriculture. He continued to finish the speech and then sat back down. Amazingly, every speaker who followed purposely copied the mistake and mispronounced the name. Matotov, one of the speakers, recalls, "If I had said it right, Stalin would have felt that I was correcting him." Molotov and all the other speakers dared not even the chance of a perceived slight towards the dictator for fear of repercussion. This led to countless other similar stories, one by a Russian novelist who tells the story of how Stalin was given a standing ovation for 11 minutes, and when the first person stopped clapping, he was arrested and sent to the Gulag. While that's quite likely fictionalized, there was a very real significant paranoia about such things, so much so that it led Stalin to perhaps an avoidable death. He went to bed one night and gave orders not to be disturbed. His guards heard him fall, but they didn't dare check in on him because they were afraid of what would happen if they defied his orders. He lay there for hours, and when he was finally found, it was too late to help him. In the end, Stalin, like many totalitarian dictators, saw himself as the living personification of the state. To question him was to question the state. And since the Soviet state was by its own teachings perfect, questioning the state was often seen as disloyal. Ultimately, Stalin was feared because he was also loved. Many, and quite likely even most of the remaining Soviets, loved him. And they were convinced that if only he knew what was wrong with their village, he could fix it. He was Russia's little father, smiling benevolently at them from portraits everywhere. After all, he had brought them material standards unheard of in their grandparents' time, and he had driven out all the Germans who had ravaged their land. The Man of Steel protected them all, built them schools, hospitals, and factories. It's important to remember that back in 1917, almost all the people of Russia had been poor. Stalin's way of life offered them very little in the way of freedom, but still more than what previous generations were offered, and this made him invulnerable. No challenge to his throne could ever succeed, because he could always appeal directly to the people he had seemingly saved. Thank you for watching today's video. I hope you enjoyed. Please consider subscribing, and hopefully we will see you in the next one.